on entry, but we just want to double check. I'm Barbara Sidman, and this is my husband, Alan, and we are the co-chairs of Tzedek LaKol.
Tzedek LaKol, Justice for All, is a Shirat Hayam member-led group that organized in October 2020 in response to ongoing issues of racial and social justice facing our country. Our first initiative was a three-part speaker series called "We Shall Not Be Silent: Conversations on Race."
Today, we continue our discussion of the ongoing issue of hate in our society. To begin our program, we'd like to introduce our Rabbi Michael Rogozin, who will present a Devar Torah. Rabbi Michael?
Thank you, Barbara and Alan. I want to thank Barbara and Alan and the rest of the leadership team at Tzedek LaKol for not only organizing today's talk, but for all of their efforts since that founding in October of 2020. I want to thank Peggy Shukur, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, and the ADL for being our speaker this morning. And just a word of Torah. One of the things that is necessary for the work to address racial justice and inequity is to listen and to hear other people's stories. And in a sense, I feel like that principle has really been the guiding principle for Tzedek LaKol in this first phase of its inception, both in terms of the "We Shall Not Be Silent" series, in which we had local Massachusetts-based African-American leaders sharing their stories and their narratives, but also in the work that I think, Jerry Kreitzer and Jeff Brand and maybe the Modorskis and others have led groups of conversation in which, instead of live presentations, there have been written content in which the focus has been on hearing other people's stories. One of the steps that we have to take in order to hear what someone else is saying is very difficult. And that's taking ourselves out of the story. That we have to perhaps put aside our narratives, our own experiences, to make space for us to hear what others are saying. And in a sense, that's what happened in last week's Torah portion from this past Shabbat, this past Saturday. There's a word which appears in every weekly Torah portion from the beginning of the book of Exodus to the last chapters of the book of Deuteronomy. But that particular word was absent from yesterday's Torah reading. It's not really a word, it's a name. And if you're into trivia, the answer is Moshe. Moshe's name does not appear in last week's Torah portion. One of the medieval commentators, the Baal HaTurim, says that one of the reasons for this is that the content of last week's Torah portion dealt with the ceremonial responsibilities of the priesthood. And Moses was going to have the responsibility of priesthood taken from him and given over to Aaron. So in a way, this Torah portion wasn't really for Moses. And I think that by removing himself from the narrative, it serves as a reinforcement of that concept, of that model, that there are times when we need to let someone else's story become center stage. And to do so, we might need to take ourselves out of the narrative to hear from them. I want to thank everybody for this call and for tuning in. I turn it back to you, Barbara and Alan.
Thank you, Rabbi Michael, for your thoughtful comments. Before we present our speaker, we have a few housekeeping notes. You may submit questions for our speaker on the chat at the bottom of your screen. Please make sure that you use the drop-down and send the questions directly to Barbara and Alan. This event is being recorded. It will be posted to the Shirat Hayam website shortly after the event. You are able to set your screen to speaker view by going to the upper right corner of your screen and clicking on View and going to Speaker.
It is our pleasure now to introduce Peggy Shukur, Deputy Regional Director of ADL New England. Peggy joined ADL in October 2019, following a career as a corporate lawyer, including serving as a general counsel of a global software and services company. She is involved with ADL New England's advocacy programs, training, strategic planning, law enforcement partnerships, outreach and engagement efforts in our collective fight against hate and anti-Semitism. She has been an active participant in pro bono, social justice, and community activities. Peggy, welcome to Shirat Hayam.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm still reflecting on the words of the Rabbi, because it really informs a lot of what we do at ADL, where right now we're trying to figure out where we lead on social justice efforts and where we need to listen to others and center their stories. So I'm going to just take a minute here and share my screen. And thank you all for having me today. I wanted to start really by noting the commitment that Shirat Hayam and the Tzedek LaKol committee has made to social and racial justice, not just by words, but by action. ADL New England, which is blessed to have a strong presence from the North Shore on our regional board, associate board, and North Shore Advisory Committee, and that's a shout out to Sherry Cashman, who I see is on our call today, covers 5 states in New England: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And as large as that is geographically, our mission is even larger: to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. It's a mission that hasn't changed since our founding in 1913. And we don't have to look beyond the North Shore to see how relevant it remains today. Continuing incidents of swastikas in Marblehead, targeting of Jewish civic leaders in Salem for their position on vaccine mandates, or the toxic culture we've seen in Danvers, where the hockey team engaged in anti-Semitic, racist, and anti-gay text messaging and hazing actions, with what appeared to be the tacit acknowledgement of coaches. ADL has been involved in each of these incidents, along with community members and community groups. And that community is a community you are part of. And we can do this because people like you let us know what's going on. So today I'm going to share with you what we're seeing at ADL in terms of hate crimes, hate incidents, and the overall state of hate. Now, this is work that feels like a Sisyphean task sometimes, but it also brings to mind Rabbi Tarfon's words, that you are not required to complete the task, yet you are not free to withdraw from it. So I hope that following our conversation today, I'll be able to leave you with better knowledge of both the manifestations of hate in our community, but also how you can stand up and speak out against it. So to start, I just want to focus on a bit of an overview of what ADL does. We fight hate through a number of ways. We have anti-bias programming that we offer through our A World of Difference program in K through 12 schools, through our Center on Extremism, which follows particularly white extremist and white nationalist activities, through our Center on Technology and Society, which focuses on online hate and by way of example, hate that proliferates on platforms such as Facebook with Holocaust denial and many other forms of hate, and through our work through our civil rights team, which focuses on a number of issues of concern to all of us, including voting rights, preserving affirmative action, and the like. So with that brief overview, I just want to focus again a little more deeply on some of the areas of civil rights activities at ADL. We do a lot of work in criminal justice reform, education equity. I mentioned the affirmative action issue, and we'll talk in a little bit about the Harvard affirmative action case, which is going to the Supreme Court, protection of free speech, but not at the expense of words that incite. Case in point, Charlottesville. We work with many immigration and refugees rights organizations. We are supporters of LGBTQ rights, both in terms of our civil rights work and advocacy work. We fight for racial justice, religious freedom, voting rights, and women's equity. To give you just a little snapshot through history, in the 1930s, ADL was involved in confronting many hate groups that were emerging at that time, the Christian Front, Silver Shirts, and the Bund. We established the first fact-finding operation aimed at monitoring and exposing extremist individuals and organizations. And this work continues today, just that the names of the groups are a bit different. In 1954, we filed an amicus brief in the landmark Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education, the historic ruling that declared that segregation in public education was unconstitutional. In 1964, we worked hand in glove with civil rights organizations for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. Again, in 1965, we worked tirelessly through the Selma Voting Rights Campaign, pushing for the passage of the landmark Voting Rights Act, and subsequently for amendments that over many decades strengthened it until the really tragic Supreme Court decision a few years ago that really undermined the premise of the Voting Rights Act in Holder v. Shelby County. 1968, we advocated and supported the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits housing discrimination on the basis of race, religion, national origin, and gender. 1981 was the year the first hate crimes legislation was developed, and ADL was at the center of developing a model for the hate crime statute and has been a tireless advocate for its passage in states nationwide. In the following years, 45 states and the District of Columbia have enacted laws similar to our ADL's hate crime model. 1988, we worked with the Japanese and Asian Pacific American communities to promote congressional approval of the Civil Liberties Act. This was a formal apology for the forced Japanese relocation and internment during World War II, and it granted reparations to Japanese Americans. In 2009, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act, the first federal hate crimes law, was enacted, and it was a landmark act that expanded the use of hate crimes laws to cover crimes motivated by a victim's sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability, in addition to those motivated by a victim's race, religion, or national origin. If folks remember, Matthew Shepard was a teenager in Wyoming who was brutally tortured and murdered because of his sexual orientation. And in 2015, ADL filed a brief in support of the Oberfell v. Hodges case, which was the same-sex marriage case, which was legalized nationwide. But there's more to be done. I've been asked to really start our conversation today with a look at a construct that we use at ADL, which is called the pyramid of hate. It's a way we understand the way hate can escalate and call it out at its different stages. So you can put in the chat if you've actually heard of the pyramid of hate before. We find it a very useful tool for understanding the intersection between bullying and bias, and it's a good visual way to understand how hate can escalate unless we step in to stop it. So going on to the first level here, the very base of this pyramid of hate is biased attitudes. So these are the little things that people tell us over and over again that, again, they tell us to get over it because they're no big deal. So that might be like stereotypes, insensitive remarks made without thought, somebody who might have chewed you down, for example, using non-inclusive language, or saying a microaggression. These are little things that often go unchecked because people often feel like there really isn't that much harm being done. But if your identity is on the receiving end of those attitudes, it actually does feel differently. And this is where it gets kind of dicey, because once we decide that those little things are acceptable, it becomes much easier for our next level to become acceptable. The next level, acts of bias, is where we get into the jokes that are biased and belittling to groups of people. It's where we get into social avoidance, dehumanization, using slurs and ridicule and bullying of people because of who they are. When we talk a little bit more about what was going on in Danvers, it definitely was at least at this level of the pyramid of hate. So when we let biased attitudes slide, biased acts are all the more likely to show up. Of course, we know it doesn't end there. If we let biased attitudes become normalized, making acts of bias like slurs and bullying become acceptable, then of course it becomes easier for the denial of justice and fair treatment for all identities to fall to the wayside and for discrimination to become normalized. Although someone can choose to discriminate on an individual level, what we're talking about next is really about discrimination through systems of power, through education, employment, housing, voting rights, criminal justice disparities, and whether it's written right into the law or it's disparate treatment as a result of systemic discrimination or racism, the effect is the same. So as we move further up the pyramid, we get to bias-motivated violence. These are examples that we've seen really in our own state. If you think back a few years, 3 Chabad centers in Massachusetts were targets of arson. Last year, an assisted living facility in Longmeadow was almost the subject of arson when somebody left an IED, an incendiary device, outside the doors of that after he had been sort of emboldened through the hate that he saw online and targeted that community. And just this week, hate crimes charges were brought against the individual who's been charged in the hate crime that involved the arson of a Black church in Springfield, Massachusetts. At the very top of the pyramid of hate is really the unthinkable: genocide, the systemic annihilation of an entire group of people. Most of us have learned about this in connection with the Holocaust, but as I'm sure you also are very well aware, it has happened again and again since that time in Rwanda, in Darfur, and the Rohingya genocide in Burma. So the point here is not to say that every insensitive remark we make is going to lead to genocide. That would be ridiculous. But what I am saying is that genocide begins with the small things, and it didn't start. And those are the things that we each need to take some time and understand how to speak up and how to speak out against. So as we move on here, there are 3 kind of definitions that I want to just level set for the rest of our conversation. One is hate. Hate's extreme dislike for someone. It can be hate on an aspect of somebody's identity, race, religion, gender, disability. It can be, a one-on-one situation. It can be systemic. It can be in a school. It can be in a community. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm using that term. A hate crime, in contrast, has a very specific meaning under the law. It's an actual criminal act, something that is a crime, but it's committed against property or a person where the victim, him or herself, is intentionally targeted because of their actual or perceived race, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, disability, gender identity, or ethnicity. We have a sort of common understanding that hateful activities should be a hate crime, but it really has a very technical meaning under the law. And that technical meaning comes from this intent to select someone because of one of those characteristics. And then a hate incident is a term we use at ADL, and it's used elsewhere to talk about acts of hate that might not be even a crime, much less a hate crime, but have an impact on a community or on a person because they're hateful. So if you live next door to someone who flies a Nazi flag or a flag that says white lives matter, that might be really offensive to you. It might be hateful to you, but because of rights of free speech, they can do that on their own property. It doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact on you or on a community. It's just not a hate crime. So we talk about those as hate incidents. So by way of example, I want to dial back to last July in Winthrop, Massachusetts. Some of you may remember that there was a complicated carjacking that involved a shooter who then had a car full of an arsenal of weapons. He killed 2 African Americans while leaving numerous white passersby unharmed. As the investigation continued, it was found on his computer that he had been researching a lot of anti-Semitic sites and where the location of nearby synagogues were. So this was a situation that was investigated as a hate crime. And in the end, the perpetrator died in the Hall incident. But had he not died, it would have been prosecuted as a hate crime. Why? Because there clearly was a crime, many crimes. There was, a shooting of 2 people who looked to be singled out due to their race. And there also looks like there was an intent to target a Jewish house of worship and intentionally to do some harm there. So that is one way we distinguish just the mere crime from that higher level of a hate crime. Similarly, the stabbing of the Brighton rabbi also illustrates this. As you remember, I think it was about a week after the situation in Winthrop, a rabbi was stabbed outside the Chabad Center in broad daylight. At the very start of this, it was actually unclear whether this met the definition of a hate crime. And many groups, including ADL, called for it to be investigated as a civil rights violation to see if there was a motive that really meant that this person was targeted because he was Jewish, because he was a rabbi. And over time that developed, and then, then DA Rachel Rollins charged this as a hate crime. But there was a period of time, I don't know if folks remember, we can talk about this afterwards, where it was unclear whether this was just a random attack of violence that was a crime, or whether it reached up to that extra level of a hate crime, which I might add, the reason why there is this extra category of a hate crime is because there is then a sentencing enhancement. People go to jail longer if there's a hate crime. The penalty is tougher. I want to now draw attention to something that's happening in a town right next to Swampscott. In the past couple of weeks, there have been 4 incidents of anti-Semitic graffiti in Marblehead. So again, the way we might look at that in this construct of a hate crime is crime. Yes, there's vandalism in the school. Is it targeted specifically against the Jewish students? This is a gray area. It's hard to say if something is just found in a public school, if it's targeting just the Jewish students, if it doesn't come with some additional words. But again, it's one of those gray areas in the law. But at the end of the day, what we're also focused on at ADL is the impact on the community that students are going to school and not feeling safe. And what can we do in terms of education and raising awareness of these issues and turning these into teachable moments for the school and the community. And then the last example that I'm just going to turn on here, just to leave you with something else that we can talk about, is something that happened just a few days ago in Salem, Mass. It actually is something that's been going on for quite a while, but it came to light just on Friday. There are members of the town's Board of Health, as you can see on the right, who have been targeted because they're perceived to be Jewish. Some are, and the reason why I'm pointing to the right, you can see their names and you can see 3 parentheses around their names. This is sort of a code to indicate that someone's Jewish. It's sometimes called the echo symbol, to put a set of 3 parentheses around somebody's name. And what's going on behind here is that there's a contingent of anti-vaxxers who are claiming that the members of the Board of Health, volunteer members of the community who are, working towards this, working with towards their civic duty, they're singling them out for being Jewish, and in a sense, making a case that the Jews are in power and controlling these decisions. So while we've been experiencing a lot of examples of Holocaust analogies being part of the conversation about the vaccine mandate, this is a different, this is an extension of it that has gone right into the fact of actually targeting individuals who are perceived to be Jewish because of someone's assumption about their last name, and sending them and the community this sort of hateful meme. On the left, the star has also been sent to these individuals as a form of protest. Hate crime or not, we'll discuss this in a little bit. Just turning for a few minutes to some statistics. The FBI is the federal agency in charge of counting up hate crimes data, and they rely on reports that they get from local police throughout the country. So 2020, which is the last year for which we have this data, it was a 12-year high, 7,759 incidents. I will say that hate crimes are notoriously underreported. They're underreported by police who don't report them into the FBI, and they're underreported by various groups who experience them because, as we're going to look at, many groups who experience hate crimes are hesitant or afraid to actually report them to the police. So just a quick quiz here. How many states have laws criminalizing bias-motivated violence or intimidation? You can put your answer in the chat or just write it down. Just take a moment here. And the answer is 46 states and the District of Columbia have hate crime laws. 4 states do not: Arkansas, Indiana, South Carolina, and Wyoming. And you can see by this color map, the type of laws, or really the scope or breadth of these laws, is a little bit different. Some are fully inclusive. By that, we mean that they include in the form of hate crimes that are motivated by bias on the relating to sexual orientation. And some are not quite as broad, and so they'll have the more traditional categories of race and religion and national origin. And then we have those 4 states in orange that have nothing. Massachusetts is deep blue, so that's a good thing. So according to the data reported to the FBI in 2020, which category do you think had the largest number of bias crimes? So again, you put this in the chat, or you can just think about it and we can look at the answer in a minute. So it is race and ethnicity. Bias reports, reports of racial bias accounted for almost 64% of all reported hate crimes in 2020. You can see this little pie chart. The second sized category is religion, followed by sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and gender. So if we look a little deeper into hate crimes based on race and ethnicity in 2020, we can see that the largest category was experienced in the form of anti-Black or African-American hate crimes. Those were the most numerous of hate crimes in 2020, with anti-Latino and anti-Asian hate crimes following. In fact, anti-Black hate crimes have always constituted a plurality of reported hate crime offenses in our country. So let's take a look at hate crimes motivated by religious bias. Those accounted for 15% of all reported hate crimes in 2020. Which religion was targeted the most? And again, I want to be really careful here to say targeted the most based on incidents that were actually reported to the FBI. So take a moment here and think about your answer. So anti-Jewish bias accounted for close to 60% of all single motive hate crimes motivated by religious bias in 2020. So notably, this reflects a very significant decline in the number reported in 2019. Crimes directed against Jews and Jewish institutions were the most numerous in this category, but represented a 29% decline from that reported in 2019. Part of the reason for that is because over time, there's been an increase in some of the crimes reported against the Muslim community. So here you can just take a look, though, at the very high number of hate crimes reported and see the really stark disparities between anti-Jewish hate crimes reported in 2020 and reported hate crimes against other groups. It's incredibly important to take all of this data with a grain of salt. The data is only as good as what's being reported to law enforcement and then reported by law enforcement up to the FBI. And the ADL has serious concerns about the substantial barriers to reporting that other religious communities have, which simply don't apply to the Jewish community. You can take another look at this, that, over the years, Jewish hate crimes have always represented the plurality of religion-based hate crimes reported out by the FBI. So just a little bit more in terms of hate crime statistics. You can see kind of a mix of the total hate crimes, many in the category of hate crime murders. You can see another really troubling statistic that reported hate crimes targeting Black people rose 43% between 2019 and 2020. And hate crimes on gender rose substantially in that time period. And no surprise, during the pandemic, reported anti-AAPI hate crimes rose 61%. Massachusetts, you can also see that the kind of breakdown against crimes against persons and property in Massachusetts are still fairly high, but they are being reported. We work fairly hard with putting pressure on law enforcement to report hate crimes to the FBI. And you can see sort of the mix of bias-motivated crimes in Massachusetts in 2020 as well, with race and ethnicity being at the top, followed by religion, sexual orientation, disability, gender, and gender identity. Now, hate crime reporting in 2020 came from, and this is the point I really want to make here, 15,000 law enforcement agencies reported, which sounds like a lot, but for the entire country, it's actually not very much, and it's even a decline relative to 2019. Only a small fraction of the agencies that participate in the FBI's data collection effort have actually even reported one hate crime. So this issue of underreporting of hate crimes is really a serious one, because without data, people don't acknowledge that there's a problem. So I'm going to turn just for a minute to white supremacist propaganda. I don't know if anyone has ever encountered something like Patriot Front stickers that somehow get plastered overnight in a town, but they are a very typical group, a white supremacist group that is making a lot of inroads in New England, and they tend to have this MO where they plaster stickers on all sorts of public spaces. The stickers are, they're called Patriot Front because they use a lot of American flag imagery and patriot imagery to lure people into the organization, but they are actually just a white supremacist group. They espouse a lot of anti-Semitism and racism, and they are very prevalent in New England. Similarly, and this is a topic really for another hour, online hate and harassment in 2020. There is so much, particularly during the pandemic, of online hate and harassment that people are experiencing. And the biggest concern with that is that people are looking at this hate online, and then they're emboldened to act on their hate. We saw that in Winthrop, we saw that in Longmeadow, and the list goes on and on. Last thing I just want to flag for you is that ADL has something called the heat map, where if you're kind of a data person and you're really interested in seeing like what's going on in your neck of the woods, you can go to the heat map on ADL's website and take a look at, you can zone right into a town or a state or any community in the United States and get a breakdown in real time of a range of hate activities, anything from white supremacist events, extremist shootouts, terrorist plots, and anti-Semitic activities as well. So data is there, and that is one place you can find it. Well, we're going to move now to what ADL is doing and how you can join us in this work. I want to draw back onto, about close to 40 years ago now, which is Lenny Zakem, who had been the iconic director of ADL New England's office for many, many years. And back in 1989, his words about racial justice and our mission are words that still inspire us today. So just to reflect on that for a moment, this is really front and center to the work we do. So among the issues that we are actively involved in right now are community-centered approaches to hate crimes, pushing back on divisive concepts laws, undermining attacks on voting rights, and fighting for racial justice. So by way of example, folks may remember back several months ago, there was a big controversy in the Boston public schools about the exam schools. And there was a change, first temporary, and then it later was extended to suspend the exam tests during COVID because it was there were inequities in who was going to be able to take the exams, and instead they were going to go to a different form for admission to the three Boston highly selective exam schools. This was immediately challenged by a group that wanted to retain the exam school, the exam structure, which is one that many groups, including ADL, felt was inherently problematic from a racial, socioeconomic, and geographical diversity perspective. And we led a group of nonprofit and business organizations and sports teams in filing an amicus brief with the US District Court in Massachusetts to uphold that temporary admissions program for the Boston public schools. That was, again, retained when it went up on appeal, but we actually expect that over time, this is a case that may reach the Supreme Court. But one of the efforts that we engaged in this past year was to bring together a broad coalition of organizations in support of this position, which we believe promoted greater racial, socioeconomic, and equity in the Boston public schools. Similarly, in terms of the Harvard case, which now is before the Supreme Court, ADL has also filed an amicus brief in this case in the First Circuit. So this is a case that actually involved a legal challenge to Harvard's race-conscious admissions policy, pursuant to which race is considered one factor among many as part of a holistic evaluation of each individual applicant. Consistent with ADL's prior affirmative action jurisprudence, ADL filed a brief in support of Harvard on appeal, and that was sustained again in the First Circuit. In support of a ruling that found that Harvard's policies don't impose quotas or assign people to categories based on race or use race as a determinant factor in making admissions decisions. So ADL got involved. When we make a decision to get involved in an amicus brief situation, we want to be able to bring up a unique point or a point that isn't already briefed by the plaintiffs and defendants in the case. So our particular position here was to make 2 points. One, that diversity in higher education is a compelling government interest. And second, that Harvard's admission practices, which are intended to promote rather than inhibit diversity, are distinguishable from Harvard's admission practices in the 1920s and 30s, which were motivated by anti-Semitism and were explicitly designed to decrease Jewish enrollment and impose a quota on Jews. The reason why we got involved is because those that were challenging Harvard's admission policy were trying to draw on those Jewish quotas to say it's a comparable situation. And we wanted to be in a position to distinguish that and support Harvard's application of race-conscious admissions policies. Again, we'll see what the Supreme Court does with this in the coming term, but it is one case that our office has been deeply involved in the past year. I'm going to turn now to divisive concepts bills, because in our advocacy work, we're seeing this come up more and more on a national scale, reading about the mass controversy in Tennessee in the past couple of weeks to what we see right in New Hampshire. So what I'm talking about here are state legislative efforts to prohibit instruction on divisive concepts and what they're inaccurately calling critical race theory. So these are laws that could limit teachers from talking with and teaching students about bias, systemic racism, and other issues of inequity. We at ADL have even seen these laws are just the sentiments being used by particular school districts to say they're going to put a pause, at least for now, on the anti-bias education work that ADL has been doing in those schools for many, many years. So because this is getting to be an issue that's captivating national attention, I wanted to just take a minute to distinguish 3 categories here. Critical race theory is technically a legal theory taught in higher education and in law school. It's the study of how laws and policies drive and perpetuate racism. It's not a theory. CRT is not something that is a pedagogy taught in elementary schools, certainly not in kindergarten, but it's kind of taken on this secondary meaning and become a buzzword of certain people and being used as a weapon to prevent the teaching of many topics related to race and systemic racism. Divisive concepts, which is the term we more often use at ADL, is what we use to describe legislative initiatives that are blocking the teaching of material that people say or perceived to be assigning blame or creating guilt or discomfort based on race, ethnicity, gender identity. And this has happened in our region in New Hampshire, where there is a law and where there's actually a group that has a bounty for turning in teachers who are violating this law. And then the third pillar here, because this is something that's going to be coming up more in Massachusetts in the coming year is ethnic studies, which is an interdisciplinary study of race and ethnicity, understood from the perspectives and experiences of historically marginalized groups. It's, all related to divisive concepts, because if you're teaching history from the perspective of a historically marginalized group, you're going to have to walk into conversations about race and ethnicity and the role of slavery, etc. There are a few ethnic studies bills that have currently been introduced in the Mass legislature. California has had its own experience there that, as an aside, resulted in some content being developed that was anti-Semitic, but that has been replaced. But the concept of ethnic studies from the ADL perspective is that it is a welcome initiative, so long as the actual practice of what is being taught ends up not being anti-Semitic. So I just want to make sure that you have an understanding of the way these three terms are understood both by ADL and how they're misused and weaponized by many other groups. So just again, this is the New Hampshire situation, where part of what we do when we monitor these bills is we'll submit testimony, speak out against it, and send letters as we did back in April. So we talked for a few minutes about Danvers, and I just wanted to highlight Danvers really as an example of what we talked about really at the beginning, which is, sometimes ADL leads, sometimes we listen to the community. And Danvers is a situation where a really horrible string of text messaging was first brought to our attention about a year and a half ago that involved a lot of homophobic, racist, anti-Semitic slurs, and that led into our learning about a number of stories that ended up being the subject of an investigative report in the Globe. Without going into all of that detail, I just want to use it as a moment to share with you that ADL gets involved in a situation like this in many levels. We provide professional development to the school, to the administrators in anti-bias education. We also work with community groups, and right now we have a very strong relationship with the NAACP of the North Shore, and continuing work to sort of look to the future to avoid situations where, in this case, we had a hockey coach who was also a school resource officer, who was also a member of the police force, have these three roles. Oh, and did I say he was also the parent of a member of the hockey team? To avoid those sorts of conflicts of interest and to put some pressure on for some change in a positive direction. But we are working with others in the community, and we see that as a really important role for us as well. Just to move on, voting rights has been a top priority at ADL in the past few years, both at the national level, where in the 2020 presidential election, we were involved in the Texas situation. If people remember, there was one ballot box for like a 600-mile wide county in Texas. So voter suppression and voter intimidation are areas that we're focused on. And similarly in Massachusetts, we were advocates and in coalition with a number of civil rights groups in support of the Massachusetts Votes Act, which recently passed. We also, while we have strong relationships with police, and they're really integral to a lot of our work on incident response, we are also advocates for police reform, and we'll use our voice in that way as well. Back to data collection. In terms of hate crime laws in Massachusetts right now, there are some amendments being considered right now in the State House. And our focus right now is for enhanced data collection, because going back to all those numbers I showed you earlier, we've got to get people to report, and we've got to have good data so we can make good decisions. One of the biggest concerns about hate crimes is that their application tends to be made in a disproportionate way. What I mean by that is that people of color are much more likely to be charged with hate crimes and thus more likely to be incarcerated longer because of those penalty enhancements, which are associated with hate crime statutes. And restorative justice is just another focus of ours. And that is alternative responses on restorative justice is something that we are hoping to build into the hate crime laws. So I'm going to just wrap this up by saying there are three things that we like to focus on at ADL. When we talk to people, we encourage you to speak up, to show strength, and to share facts. So without going into that in great detail, I think what I will do is then just highlight two programs. One is our No Place for Hate, which schools can sign up for and become No Place for Hate schools by engaging in anti-bias activities, and highlighting that it's really, really important to report incidents. You can do this easily right on our website. And at this point, I think what I will do is stop sharing and we can have a conversation.
Thanks so much, Peggy. And let's take a few questions from the chat. One of the questions was, is what we are seeing with the voting rights discrimination on the level of systemic discrimination in our society? And how do we respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really thoughtful question. In a way, it has the, we often in these conversations, we talk about the intent of someone and the impact. And in this case, we can have arguments about the intent of people who are promoting voter suppression efforts, but the impact, when you look at what the impact of these laws restricting voting rights and access to the vote and making it that much harder for people to exercise their right to vote, whether they have to stand in line longer, whether they have to provide additional IDs, whether they can't vote by mail, that's certainly having the impact of suppressing voter participation. So is that part of systemic racism? I'd say arguably, in my opinion, yes. You're on mute, so I'm not hearing you, Barbara.
Whoops, sorry. Can you clarify what we tell our children about anti-Semitism? I think part of that conversation is their age, but the framework we tend to use at ADL is to explain what anti-Semitism is, but also understand it within a whole system of oppression. So there are many groups in our country who are oppressed and marginalized. So anti-Semitism is one form of a system of oppression. Ageism may be another, racism may be another, and they all manifest differently. But what we often like to stress when we're talking about anti-Semitism with children is that they're not alone, that they can ask for help, and make sure they know who to turn to for that help. When you go into the schools, are you offering specific programs or are you working with the teachers directly in the classroom? Exactly what happens in the schools?
Well, a couple different things. So we have 2 educators on our staff at ADL New England who are professional educators. They actually run our primary school program for students or professional development for teachers and administrators called A World of Difference, which is our anti-bias training. So one way they do this is through a peer-led, so working with middle school and high school student leaders to become the peer leaders within their schools so that they have the skills to lead the fight against bias when they experience it. Part of our work and research has shown that when students hear from other students, that makes almost a bigger difference than some adult telling them what to do. By the same token, we provide a lot of professional development. And then on the incident response side, which is an area I'm more involved with, when there is an incident in the school, we provide resources to the school to help them respond. There's a book that, a guidebook on our website, which is a guide to responding to incidents of hate and bias. So it's not limited to anti-Semitism, but a whole range of all the hateful incidents we see in school. And it gives sort of a checklist or a guide for administrators when they encounter it, because everybody's going to, in terms of communicating quickly with the community, communicating promptly with the parents, but also lessons and reflections to turn it into a teachable moment. If students don't know what a swastika is, then they don't really understand why their Jewish classmates are so harmed when they see it carved on a desk.
All right. Peggy, thank you again for this exceptional and important presentation. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot of information that we in our committee will use as we all continue this important work.
Continuing our observance of Black History Month, Tzedek LaKol invites you to view Shared Legacies, a fascinating documentary about Black-Jewish cooperation during the Civil Rights era. There will be narrations by eyewitnesses, activists, Holocaust survivors, and leaders of the movement, such as Congressman John Lewis, Ambassador Andrew Young, Rabbi Alvin Sugarman, Rabbi Peter S. Berg, actor Louis Gossett Jr., and members of the King family. The film will be available to view on your own from Thursday afternoon, February 24th, until our discussion on February 28th at 7:30. Please register and you will be sent the Zoom link for the discussion, and then closer to February 24th, you will receive the link for the movie.
Thanks again to Peggy, and thank you all for joining us this morning. And we hope to see you at our next event. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Peggy.